Spring 217 BC. Hannibal's army stood at a crossroads in northern Italy, and every option in front of him was bad. Two new Roman consuls had marched north with fresh legions, each holding a different road south, each road narrow enough for the two forces to converge and crush him between them. Take either path, and Rome would see him coming days before he arrived. So he chose the one route nobody was watching, the flooded lowlands of the Arno, swollen with spring runoff into an unbroken swamp. No army crossed there. That was exactly the point. It took 4 days and 3 nights, wading through water that never dropped below the knee and often rose past the waist. Soldiers slept standing, propped against dead pack animals, because there was no dry ground to lie on. Fever spread through the Gallic contingents fastest. Men who had marched from northern Italy to fight Rome on Hannibal's promise of plunder and revenge, now dying of exhaustion in a swamp that had nothing to do with either. Pack mules went under in the mud, taking supplies with them. Hannibal himself caught an infection in one eye that the wet and the lack of rest never let heal. By the time his army reached dry ground, he had lost it permanently. He emerged on the other side, ahead of both consular armies, fully behind the Roman defensive line, in the rich farmland of Etruria, and no Roman scout had seen him do it for days. For days, Rome still believed him trapped in the north, watching roads he had no further use for. The cost of the crossing wasn't only physical. Hannibal had entered Italy with a coalition held together by promises rather than loyalty. Gauls who had joined him to drive Romans off their land, not to die anonymously in a swamp that offered no glory and no plunder. Every dead Gaul in the Arno was a small withdrawal against a debt Hannibal still needed to repay, and he knew it. The army that walked out the far side was thinner, sickle, and owed an explanation it hadn't yet earned. The army Hannibal now stood behind belonged to Gaius Flaminius, a consul who had built his political career breaking Gallic tribes in the north and distributing their land to Roman settlers. Hannibal's own ranks were full of Gauls who remembered exactly whose fields those had been. Rather than march on Flaminius directly, Hannibal turned his army loose on the Etrurian countryside south of him, burning farms, sacking villages, cutting the supply roads toward Rome itself, while making no move to engage. It was a calculated provocation. Flaminius was known as a man allergic to looking passive, and Hannibal was betting that watching smoke rise from Roman soil while he sat at Arretium would be more than his pride could stand. His officers urged caution. Word had it the second consul, Servilius, was still days away with a separate army. Combined, the two could box Hannibal in. Wait, they told Flaminius. Let the armies join. Flaminius didn't wait. Within a day of the burning starting, he broke camp and marched his column south along the only road that followed Hannibal's trail. Fast, angry, and almost entirely unscouted. He believed he was chasing a beaten force in retreat. He had no idea he was walking into the only piece of ground in the region to swallow an army whole. The road ran along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, squeezed into a narrow strip between the water and a half-ring of wooded hills, opening into passes at either end. Hannibal had scouted it days in advance, and the terrain did most of his planning for him. At the far exit of the valley, where the road opened back out, he stationed his heaviest infantry, seasoned African and Iberian veterans, to seal the only way through. Along the slopes overlooking the road itself, hidden in the tree line, he placed the bulk of his Gallic troops, told to stay silent and wait until the entire Roman column had filed past beneath them. At the entrance behind, his cavalry waited to close the door once the Romans were inside. He banned fires on the high ground that night and forbade anything that might silhouette a man against the sky. Meanwhile, decoy fires burned far ahead, deep in the valley, exactly where a retreating army would be expected to camp. Visible, distant, and utterly false. The plan required only one thing to fail: a single Roman scout glancing up at the wrong moment. Flaminius sent none. He marched at dawn with his column strung out along the lakeshore road, eyes fixed on the smoke ahead, certain the war was already won. The trap sprang the instant the Roman column was fully committed to the road, strung out, unable to form a battle line, water on one flank and slope on the other. Hannibal's signal brought the hillside down all at once. Gallic warriors who had waited motionless for hours poured into the Roman center, while the column was still mid-march. Behind them, the cavalry swung shut across the entrance, and the men at the rear realized in the same instant that there was no way back the way they'd come. What followed was less a battle than a collapse. Thick morning mist off the lake meant most Roman officers couldn't see 50 feet in any direction, let alone organize a response. Ancient writers later noted that an earthquake struck the region during the fighting, strong enough to bring down buildings nearby, and that not a single man in that valley reported feeling it. There was no attention left to spare. Thousands tried to escape into the lake itself and drowned under the weight of their own armor. Near the road, a corps of Roman soldiers managed to form up and fought on for hours longer, rallying around Flaminius himself until he was killed in the fighting. His body never recovered afterward. Only a few thousand men broke through the African line at the valley's far end and escaped into the hills, and even they were surrounded and forced to surrender the following morning. By the time it ended, somewhere around 15,000 Romans were dead, and most of the rest captured. Hannibal's own losses were comparatively light. Hannibal released the captured Italian allies without ransom, telling them plainly that his war was with Rome, not with them. A calculated move meant to fracture Rome's alliance network from within, since every freed ally went home asking whether this was really their fight. A second disaster followed within days. Servilius, the other consul, had sent 4,000 cavalry ahead to link up with Flaminius, unaware he was already dead. Hannibal's officer Maharbal intercepted and destroyed that force before word of the defeat even reached them. In Rome, the response was unprecedented. The Senate appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, handing total command of the war to one man for the first time in generations. His strategy was simple: refuse Hannibal a battle entirely and starve his momentum through delay rather than confrontation. It worked for a time. Fabius shadowed Hannibal across Italy without offering battle, harassing supply lines and letting the Carthaginians' momentum bleed out on its own. A response many Romans found humiliating, but that kept the Republic's last intact army from sharing the fate of the first two. Critics in the Senate called him a coward. History would later call the approach Phoebean for a reason. But patience has never been a popular wartime virtue, and Rome wouldn't hold that strategy forever. A year later, at a field called Cannae, command passed back to consuls eager to finish what Flaminius had started. They gathered the largest army the Republic had ever fielded, well over 80,000 men, and threw it at Hannibal all at once. By nightfall, most of them were dead. It remains, even now, the single bloodiest day in the history of Rome.